But we have one of the most interesting stories, surely, in the whole of the Bible, in this 5th chapter of 2 Kings. It's always been a favourite, but it always seems to have some special little things that we haven't seen before. It seems to me that's the case. It's a story of such remarkable quality. The whole idea of an Israelite maid giving advice about the health of a general, the general of the country of Syria, is just quite just off the rails, isn't it? How did this ever happen? How would he ever listen to her? How would she ever dare to think that she had a solution to an incorrigible disease? Naaman's leprosy was irreversible. If you got leprosy, you died. That was the simple equation. And yet that's not what happens in this chapter. So it's just really a remarkable chapter. Even if we know it well, it still is a very remarkable chapter. So it begins in verse 1. Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man. Syria was Israel's big opposition at this time. All the wars with the northern kingdom of Israel seemed to be with Syria. And this man was the second in the land. It says that he was captain of the host of the king of Syria, which means that of their fighting forces, he was the top man, which would mean that in the cabinet, in the rulership of Syria, he was probably number 2 man. He was a very important person in Syria. But despite all his wonderful achievements on the field of battle, his health was gone. And he was a man who was hit by leprosy. So we read in verse 1, he was a great man with his master, that is the king of Syria, and honourable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valour, but he was a leper. So you can see from that he was a very, very honoured person in Syria. And for 2 reasons. He was a very accomplished soldier. He was excellent in working out the plans and seeing them implemented and leading among men. But it also notes that he was a great man with his master, that is the king. He therefore had good relationship with the king of Syria. And it says he was honourable. And the sense of the word is just that. He was a man of respect. He respected the king, and yet he was number 2. Usually that position means that people trying to sort of compete with the man at the top. But he didn't. He was respectful of the royal situation in Syria, and therefore he was respected from the king down. He was a popular hero because he was a mighty man in valour. But it was all coming to an end, because he had this dreadful disease. Now, leprosy really is a terrible thing. And it comes sort of gradually upon a person, and it eats away at his bones, and it eats away at his sinews, until eventually his eyes are just sort of standing in their sockets, and his fingers begin to gradually crumble, and he loses. It's a terrible, progressive disease. Now, you imagine what that meant to a man who was number 1 soldier. And he had all these ribbons behind of achievement, and now instead of being able to go out to the battle at all, he could see that his days were finished. Well, verse 2 says, the Syrians had gone out by companies, that's groups of soldiers, and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. That's the sort of thing that very often happened. You might remember in the book of Judges, there's a song called the Song of Deborah, and it speaks about the mother of the generals. She's waiting for him to come home, and they sort of distribute themselves a couple of girls each or something like that. That was the kind of thing that happened. So when these soldiers of Syria were coming back, they took hold of this young girl. Out of her circumstances, she's an Israelite girl, she's happy at home, they've taken the place, the Syrians, and so they just grab her as they're on their way. I don't know why they took her, but they probably took a number of girls. This is one of them. And this girl has become the nursemaid of Naaman's wife. So Naaman is married, and this little girl has been brought back to Syria from Israel, completely estranged. We don't know what age she was. I guess she was sort of a teenage girl. And she waited on Naaman's wife, it says. So when the kitchen had to be cleaned up, she got to it and made sure it was right. When the beds had to be made, she was involved in all the chores of this very big home that they would have had, a very eminent place. This little girl was, well, she was one of the maids, if she wasn't the only one. But look at verse 3. She's not an ordinary girl. She said unto her master, would God, my Lord, that is her master, which is Naaman of verse 1, where it says, my Lord, it's not speaking of God there, it's of Naaman who was her Lord. That is, her Lord in the home. She had to do what he said. That was the person she was employed with. And so she says, I would God were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. Wow, what a message. Fancy her having some comment upon this. What does that tell you about the relationship between this little girl and Naaman? It means she really did think a lot of Naaman, doesn't it? That's her boss. And not often is it that a teenage child would be that thrilled with their boss, perhaps. But this girl really wants him to get better. And she wants her boss to be brought to good health by a prophet of her own country. She came from Israel, the northern part of Israel, which was called Samaria. That was the capital city. And she, in her young teenage mind, thought, if only I could get my boss across to Samaria, there's a chance that he could be healed. Now, very few people would ever have imagined that he could be healed. It was considered the incorrigible disease. If you got it, then you just awaited death that followed. It must mean that she really respected him. What I could say is she really loved his administration. And so the word honourable in verse 1 becomes more pertinent, doesn't it? He in no way had ill-treated her. He hadn't taken advantage of her single status. He had obviously treated her with dignity and respect, and she appreciated that. She was well cared for in Naaman's house. So much that she really wanted him to get better. But she thought there's absolutely no chance of that happening in Syria. Syria have not got the God of Israel. They've not got the powers to do anything about leprosy at all. The only person being that could help with leprosy is the God of Israel. But he's over here. He's in Syria. The prophet for Yahweh is in Israel, in Samaria. How can she bring the two things together? Yet she wants to, because she thought so much of her employer. And verse 4 says that somebody got to know what she had said, and one went in and told his Lord, saying, that is, told Naaman, the Lord of this house, one went into him and told his Lord, saying, thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. Well, piece of hot news, isn't it? In the gossip of a large house, that would be hot news indeed. But it was almost ridiculous, because what could this little girl do? What could anybody do about leprosy? So this person, however, he's heard her say that, and he's not a silly person. He evaluates her, doesn't he? By that passing on to the next stage, it says that he took notice of that little girl. It must mean that. He didn't take her for being a fool. She really meant it when she said it. He saw it. And he thought, I actually think that little girl's pretty remarkable. And her way of life is exemplary. And this is what she says. That there's a prophet in Samaria, her own country, who could heal this situation. And so much does this person, who's unmentioned, have trust in the little maid from Israel, that he actually passes that on. And so, verse 5, the message came to the king of Syria. King of Syria. So if you've got yourself rightly positioned, this is Naaman in Syria. Now this message has come to the king of Syria, the number one person in the country. And you see, he thought a lot of Naaman because they had a lot of very good victories on the battlefield because of the leadership of Naaman. So verse 5, the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. Now, I find that's just astonishing, isn't it? On what advice is the king of Syria now loading up his chariot to take Naaman across to Samaria on the advice of this little girl? I mean, she's no medical advisor, is she? What does she know about the whole business? But it tells us, if we think about that carefully, it tells us that not only Naaman thought a lot about this little girl, but so did his wife, and so did this king. When the message came up to him, he only had to say this was from the little Israelite maid, and they knew who you're talking about. So in the employment of Naaman and in the employment of the palace itself, where the king was, there was obviously quite a lot of discussion about this amazing little girl from Israel, whose name we do not know. Isn't that an intriguing story? That such a young and ill and a person with very little experience and no knowledge of Syria should actually be making a statement about the health of the general of the country. And the king is listening to what she had to say. That tells us volumes about this young girl. And it's in keeping with the rest of the story, as we'll see. So verse 5 says, middle verse, he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 pieces of gold and 10 changes of raiment. That's staggering, because that's a great sum of money. How much exactly it would be on today's tallies, I wouldn't be sure. But a lot of money, a huge amount of money. And again, you think, if they have put that kind of money away, it's millions of dollars for the health of their chief captain. It shows what they thought about the chief captain. Naaman was absolutely respected in Syria. But it also means they respected that young girl. Well, they'd never take any notice of her, let alone put $10 million on the matter. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of all this money and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel. And that's quite a journey. From Damascus, the capital of Syria, to Samaria, which is in Israel, would be something like 50 miles. It might even be more like 100 miles. But it was a fair distance. So you've got to put all this together. You've got to get a whole lot of chariots and equipment and soldiers and horses and get them all with their food and so forth. And away you go for a mission which is on the advice of a young girl who had no importance in Syria at all. But the king so much thought of Naaman that he actually went ahead with this and got all this ready, and it sent it. It says in verse 6, he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. So kings talk to kings, you see. So this king of Syria, rather than send a message to Elisha, He sends it to the king of Israel, because that's how kings sort of operate, king to king, not to lower people down the line. But eventually, the matter comes to the king of Israel. Verse 7, it came to pass when the king of Israel had read the letter that he rent his clothes. He just tore his clothes up. He was absolutely offended by this letter that came from the king of Syria, because he thought that the king of Syria was making a fool of him, because nobody could heal a person who had leprosy. So what's this king of Israel doing, making a joke of me? Nobody can cure leprosy. He's just trying to make a bit of a nasty turn to gender some enmity with us. He seeketh a quarrel. See at the end of verse 7, that's how he read it. The king of Israel, rather than take any notice of the message, he just thinks this is a game that the king of Syria is playing against him and trying to make him look stupid. Well, who's going to look stupid in the end? So in his fury, he says, verse 7, halfway through, am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. He's just picking a fight. Well, in the same city of Samaria where the king of Israel was where Elisha, the prophet, was living. I don't know, it was 100 yards down the way or 200 yards, but they were both in Samaria. They weren't huge cities like you and I think of today. It was so, in verse 8, when Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, wherefore have you rent your clothes? Let this man come now to me, that is Naaman, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. What Elisha is saying is no use going to the king of Israel to get a cure of leprosy, but there is a prophet in Israel, and it's of course himself, Elisha, and if he comes, he will learn that there's a prophet in Israel, not a king. The king was a ratbag. He wasn't a faithful man at all. And that's an Australian term, by the way. John liked it. It was so, verse 8, that when Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes, he says, let him come to me. That is, to the prophet in Israel. Well, that's a bit of a tough one for the king of Israel to take, isn't it? He's in his royal dignity, and this king has written to him with this amazing request, and all it's done is bring fury to the king of Israel. And now he gets a message from this prophet down the road, and he says, just a moment, he said, before you tell him to go, just tell him to come round to my place. And you'll find out that there's a God of Israel, and there's a prophet of the God of Israel here. Well, Naaman did it. He came with his horses, verse 9, and with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. That's what people of eminence do. They don't get out of the car themselves. They wait for people to come to them. But you notice that Elisha hasn't gone to the door, has he? So Naaman's standing at the door of Elisha, and he's not doing anything to sort of invite him to say, come in, let's have a cup of coffee or something. He just gives him a message. Simple as that. He sent a message, verse 10, unto him saying, go and wash in the river Jordan. Put there in your Bible, river Jordan, because that's what it means. And go and wash in the river Jordan 7 times. And thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. Now there's quite a distance between Samaria and the river Jordan. It's quite a trek. In those days, it would have been several days to get there from Samaria. So, all right, there's a fair distance in it. But if you could get free from a disease that was otherwise going to kill you, then it's a very cheap way of getting right, isn't it? You pay that medical bill, no trouble at all. However, Naaman did have a pride. And he thought, go down to the river Jordan. And he says, it's just like a muddy stream. And it is for a lot of the year. It's got a lot of brush and so forth around it. And it's not a beautiful, smooth, lovely river like you might see in Canada with nice banks and all cared for. It's not like that. And it's mostly rather muddy in its surge of water. It's called the descender. That's what the River Jordan means, because it's very rapid. It gets quite dirty. Naaman's thinking to him, goodness me, go down to that little stream. Why, he says, back in Damascus, we've got these beautiful big rivers, really good, great rivers. And now you want me to go in this muddy stream. And he got really itchy about it. Stood on his dicks and thought, blow that, I'm not going to be humiliated by such a request. Verse 11, Naaman was wroth, and he went away and said, behold, I thought he will surely come out to me. I'm a dignitary, I'm a second person in Syria, visiting their country, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, of Yahweh his God. He knew the name of Israel's God. Interesting. How did he know that? That little girl must have said a few things, I think, in her time. To call on the name of the Lord his God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. Just as simple as that. All very convenient for me. Just give me the cost and I'll fix it up. And so he says in verse 12 about the rivers of the city that he lived in, which was Damascus, the capital of Syria. Are not the rivers Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? And it's be true, absolutely true. Both good rivers, they come down from the hills in the north of that country. Then are all the waters, verse 12 as well, just to finish. May I not wash in them? Can't I go home and go through this rather undignified process? Can I go home and wash in them and be clean? So he turned and he went away in a rush. We do some silly things in our anger, don't we? Some really silly things. He was insulted by the simplicity of what he was asked to do, and he did not want to do that. It's really hard to see exactly how he felt, but it was his pride that was really hurt. However, his servants who had come with him obviously thought a lot of Naaman, and they could see that, look, if there is a chance that this works, then isn't that not worth it? Perhaps they thought even a bit more than that. Perhaps they also thought that this little girl that's come from Israel, she's done some amazing things. She said some amazing things, and her way of life is exceptionally wonderful. I wonder if that's not also involved in it, because they stand up, straight up, and say to Naaman, look, don't get in a huff about this. Here's an opportunity. If you were asked to climb this great mountain, you'd do it, and you did do it. He was a man of prowess. Now you're asked just to go into the stream, and go into the stream 7 times and you were fixed. Surely that's worth the healing of leprosy. Well, they were good servants, weren't they? Because that was a good argument. We want to avoid getting in a huff and saying a whole lot of silly things, because later on we sometimes have to eat our words. Be careful about saying things when you're in a rage or when your reputation is in doubt, or somebody's making fun of you, as it seems to be. So in verse 13, halfway through that verse, it says, my father, that's the servants that were with Naaman, which means again that they respected him, didn't they? My father, they called him. If the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldst thou not have done it? How much rather then that he saith to thee, wash and be clean? What could be easier than that? Well, here's the better side of Naaman. He immediately took the advice of his servants. Then went he down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, which was a fair way away from Damascus, according to the saying of the man of God, or from Samaria rather, according to the saying of the man of God. and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So this terrible rash of leprosy he had, where certain parts of his body or knuckles or whatever else it might be, some of his toes were missing, all that was fixed in a flash. And it must have been a very momentous thing, because you could go under the water 6 times and would you be clean? No. Not in the first time, not in the second, right through to the 6th, no change at all. It's just exactly the same as it was with the leprosy. And he went in the 7th time and he came up, and lo and behold, his flesh was like that of a young child. As it says at the end of verse 14, his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. How would you feel? There's a ticket to life. In one stroke, he has been healed from his leprosy. Now, leprosy was just never a matter of being healed. It was just a dreadful disease that continually went on in a person's being in there until eventually it destroyed that person. In a flash, this man has gone under the waters 7 times, and he's come up, and now he's clean like a young child. So verse 15, what's he going to do? He's full of gratitude. Naaman is a man of honour, and he's exceedingly joyous with his new, fresh condition. We can only imagine how he felt. And he returned to Elisha, who's described right through this as the man of God. He and all his company, they were all in it. It was a happy entourage of people that were returning to Syria. They were just absolutely thrilled with what had happened. He and all his company. And they came and stood before him. Seems that he sort of opened the door this time. And he said, "Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth," said Naaman. What a statement. "But in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant." You remember all those things which he had brought to Syria? That tremendous amount of money in verse 5, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. So he brings that all out of the little carts that they had taken across, and he puts it in Elisha's home. But Elisha's not interested in the money. He wasn't doing that because of the personal advance to himself. Elisha's response was surprising to Naaman. Verse 16, he said, "As the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." And he urged him to take it, but he wouldn't. Elisha was living in a modest home, I'm sure, a very modest home, but he was not going to take that money from Naaman. Why not? What if he had taken the money? What if Elisha went out and bought a new house the next day, a new car or something? What would it have done to the miracle? There would have been a double motive involved in it, wouldn't it? Oh yes, he wanted to heal Naaman, but look, he's a rich man now. Look what he's got. And Elisha the prophet was faithful enough to see that it would destroy his reputation. He wasn't interested in present wealth, but he was pleased to see the recovery of Naaman. Now Naaman's a bit amazed by all of that. He just can't understand why Elisha hasn't been thankful about the things that he brought. And it says in verse 17 that Naaman said, "Shall there not then, I pray thee, be given to thy servant 2 mules' burden of earth? For thy servant will henceforth offer neither burnt offering nor sacrifice unto other gods, but unto Yahweh." You see, he did know the name of the God of Israel, didn't he? He used it in verse 11, the name of Yahweh his God. He had heard that. He probably had heard it because of that little girl. That little girl's message was open. She was a person that when she was at school or when she was wherever in the public, she spoke about her convictions. Obviously she did. And people respected her. She was a diligent girl. What she was asked to do, she did it with immediate desire, and she was cheerful, and she was a very wonderful inspiration in the house of Naaman. And a lot of people obviously heard about that. And so Naaman himself here is fully aware of the God of Israel. Will henceforth offer neither burnt offering nor sacrifice, he says now, unto other gods, but unto Yahweh, the God of Israel. Naaman's a converted man. And he says, I'm going home, but I'm not going to worship where I've worshipped before. Where's he going to worship? Who's he going to see when he gets back? Who's the first person he'll see? His wife, I suppose. But second, he's going to thank that little girl, isn't he? His heart is just thumping in him to see her and to thank her for her wise advice. He can't comprehend. He's the only man in the world that's ever got out of that disease of leprosy, and he feels as fit as when he was 30. He's a new man altogether, and he wants to thank that young girl. But she doesn't go to the worship of the gods of Samaria, of Syria. She has her own worship. She obviously did. She had kept her worship of the God of Israel while she was in captivity. And she was not going to change that, of course. In fact, what was happening in Naaman's house is that there were more and more people interested in her religion rather than the gods of the Syrians. Though she was young and though she was just a servant in the place, her influence had permeated that home. So when he came home, he said, I want to have some earth from Israel because I'm going to build an altar and I'm going to worship by that altar. An altar not made out of human hand, but made of earth that came from Israel. Now, it's amazing, isn't it? It was allowable under the law to make an altar that was made out of earth. And he knew that too. So rather than say, look, I'll take home this from Israel, this is a lovely flower that they have in Israel, we don't have in Syria, or some other thing that people do. This man took 2 heaps of soil back with him. A very unusual thing to do. And the reason was he had changed his worship. And he admitted that. And in fact, he made provision before he left Israel to take that earth, to take it back to Samaria, to Damascus. And I'm certain that there would have been people meeting with her on the day, that the first Sabbath that they had. I'm sure there would have been people meeting, and one of them would have been Naaman in the front row, and one of them would be his wife. She would just be so thrilled with the change of circumstances. What about the soldiers that went down? If you were among some of those soldiers that went down with your horse and your chariot and so forth, with all this gold and silver, and came back and seen the whole thing, saw the 6 times and the 7th and the curing, where would you worship the next Sunday? That girl's having an imprint upon the whole of Syria. We're not talking about some outward suburb. We're talking about what's happening in the circumstances of the palace and the head of the army. This is top stuff. And that little girl, because of her faith in retaining the truth and standing up for it, was actually affecting her circumstances. That's inspirational. You go to school. Some of you still do. But it means that our children can be influential for good if we train them to do that, to stand up and to be courageous, to stand up for the God of Israel and for the principles of the truth, to seek baptism if we haven't got the river flowing through our country, Jordan, where he was asked to go. We nevertheless have baptism, which is where we feel that we are refreshed in life, This man has been through a circumstance in which his whole life has been changed. And I think you would have had many of those soldiers that say, well, I'm not going to the house of Rimmon anymore to worship there, because obviously he could do nothing. That God does not work, but this one does. And we saw it. We were there. And I'm sure a lot of people would say, but this is really what happened when you were over there in Damascus. Surely this wasn't like that. And they would witness. And they say, well, it was. You still knew how he was before. You could see how he is now. And we were there. It's a good thing there was a number of people there, wasn't it? So the story is I don't call it the story of Naaman, I call it the story of the little Israelitish maid. Because in the end, she's really the star of the show, isn't she? She stood by what she knew was right. And when our children go to school, and they're in other company sometimes, as we unfortunately have to be, we have to ensure that our children know how to stand up and stand up for the things of Israel, stand up for the covenant of Israel and for the Lord Jesus Christ and the baptism which can give to us life in otherwise very difficult circumstances. I think that's one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible. I am interested to know that in Syria they've had for many, many centuries of time, they've had a Jewish community. It's had its own place of worship and so forth in Damascus. And I just wonder, because things in the Middle East, they happen very slowly over a long period of time. It's not like Canada and Australia where they're knocking things over and building new things all the time. No, something that's established is established and just stays there for centuries of time. And I wouldn't be surprised if that Jewish community goes right back to the time of that little girl, when she stood up for her beliefs in a foreign country, and that eventually affected other people when they saw the miracles that happened through the God of Israel. And so that would have been establishment of an Israel-thinking community. And if there were other Jews that were in Damascus, that's where they would have gone. And then there were Gentiles that came like the soldiers, like Naaman himself and his wife. And they all established a different and true and correct form of judgment.